Thank you. Carola Weil with USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism in Los Angeles. These are very interesting findings on a number of levels, but I wonder if I could push you on 2 points in particular, coming back to some of the comments that Paul and Charles made about how do you actually convey the message, and I think the comment earlier also about how do you get the word out about your findings. With regard to the focus groups, you'd mentioned they were very diverse. How diverse were they ethnically or representing diaspora constituencies? Did you have, I mean, particularly in the case of the US and the UK, it might be less so for Germany. It certainly would be an issue for France, where you have very multicultural populations. Did you find differences across ethnic representation? Because we find one of the challenges with development dialogues has been that it has been largely dominated by majority populations. I mean, if you look around this room alone, there is a disconnect there between your target audience or the target goal at the end of the day, which is to educate about international development, when the majority of the world is not white, they're not middle class, they're not, or at least not elite upper classes. Second question is how do you connect across your constituencies? So if you were to have focus groups that included citizens, influentials, and decision makers in one room, and you threw them all together, would you get a very different outcome? Would you get simply an addition of all of your perspectives? Or is that perhaps a more productive way of going, rather than trying to compartmentalize and have such a targeted campaign, if you will, or strategy, that you still don't develop the necessary connections from your engaged citizens to your engaged decision makers? How do you connect the dots across the way? Thank you.
On the first question regarding the diversity of the groups, first of all, they were the focus groups specifically were very diverse on ethnic and racial grounds, and on religious grounds, and all of the other samples, the survey samples, were nationally representative of the urban population in each of the 5 countries. We have not looked at subgroup analysis across the different subgroups within the country, so I can't speak to that question specifically. But we had a very, very interesting, I don't know if Kel has left the room and some of the other foundation people are here, we had a very interesting conversation with the communications team in Seattle from the foundation around young people and how to, again, Stephen's question around the 16 to 25-year-olds. And my comment back to the foundation people was, when I think about young people, I'm not thinking about young people in Ohio. I'm thinking about where the largest proportions of young people are in the world. And they're in India and China and Southeast Asia and in Africa. And if you're thinking about a long-term strategy where you want to engage young people around these issues, that's a whole other agenda. That's about a long-term, a medium to long-term agenda. On the question about how you create a kind of a communication strategy or a messaging to embrace influential citizens and policymakers, I do think that there's a lot of kind of rich thinking in this value framing work that I had mentioned at the beginning, authored by Darnton and Kirk. Martin Kirk, by the way, is the head of campaigns from Oxfam, UK. But it's a very thoughtful piece, because it's saying, what do we have in common? What do we care about as policymakers? What are the values that we aspire to? What are the values we aspire to as influentials? What are our organizations committed to across faith-based groups, for example, where rather than emphasizing the differences, you're emphasizing the commonalities? And the same for citizens. And it seems like it's a very useful framework, a common language, a common currency on which people find it much easier to connect, not with an issue, but with a way of thinking. And then through that way of thinking, all of the issues come in, whether it's climate change, whether it's fair trade, whether it's education. If, for example, your focus is on equality, Well, equality manifests itself in all sorts of ways around development issues. That becomes a much easier language for people to share than just being very issue and organizationally driven. Not sure if that answers your question, Kroll. It's a slightly different way into it.
Maybe just one additional comment on the diaspora, and again, I think Jerry's getting at the points I would have made in terms of your answering your question to a couple of other vignettes. Cincinnati was not where I expected to find a 300-person gathering around African policy issues. Had a lot of Africans, professionals who had been, probably emigrated to the United States in the past 20 years, and then other folks as well. And it was around the church and the diocese and its quote-unquote mission work, but it wasn't about the traditional, what we'd call mission. On the contrary, it was about African policy, the role of the U.S. government. There was everything in the speeches and the discussions, everything from anti-imperialist to kind of charity discussions, if you will. And then later, everyone retired to a great meal, and then there was a church service in which the Nigerian Ladies Auxiliary Dance Troupe brought the next generation of Nigerian Americans out to enculturate the Cincinnati church with the Nigerian dances, and that blew my mind. It was also a place where again, there was eventually some fundraising going on as well. But I think the secret handshake of the influentials in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and this relates therefore to development, trade, and these other issues. It's cracking a bit, and I was mentioning you can't have a meeting in Washington around the Democratic Republic of Congo without rules about the mic, because all the Congolese groups are going to come and vie for each other to take the microphone because they don't always have the same point of view. So I think there's some, as well as all of the work that's being done by diaspora groups that are going back. Particularly, we think about crisis situations, but also in terms of the issues of corruption, the issues that are not about aid. So I think the linking constituencies is also an interesting, for us, one of the most important things about having often church constituencies in the developing world, but also new donors, not just China and Brazil, but the Philippines, South Korea, and the Korean Americans and their influence on U.S. policy, at least in the past, in terms of food aid and linkages to North Korea. This is beginning to have an effect on policy and also the way people think about development.
Okay, hello, I'm Catherine, and I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer from El Salvador, 2011-2012. And I was very happy with this research because a lot of it reiterated what I did with my life for the past year. So I'm very grateful that you guys have done this research to talk particularly about the difference of personal stories and friendships on public opinion. And well, that is wonderful. Charles isn't here anymore, but not to be depressing, he mentioned the switch from charity work to partnerships. And Peace Corps has just begun, and I think it should be more developed, but a reverse Peace Corps, bringing volunteers from all over the world to the United States to help improve our communities here. I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit. I wonder if at all there was any mention of people from the developed world saying, hey, let's look at what the developing world is doing. Maybe they have the solution to the problems that we're working on. Maybe they're coming up with innovative approaches. I can speak from the United States. I particularly feel that we see ourselves as the exception. And when I was in El Salvador, there's lots of times I think that Salvadorian governmental officials should come to the United States and share some ideas, because there are ways in which they were doing things in the developing world very well. And that's the shift from charity to partnership. So I wonder if at all, if it wasn't mentioned, that maybe says something as well, but if you could comment on that.
I think the only country where that was mentioned was probably Germany, where people made reference to M-Pesa in Kenyan and how good that model is, but not in the other countries. In China is a specific example because they consider themselves to be a developing country, so they struggle to think about the concept of international development outside of China. But the only example was Germany. They are much more outward-looking than some of the other countries in terms of the international development.
Anybody else? Okay.
One of the things, oh hi, I'm Liza Douglas from Plan International USA. You didn't mention it in the presentation, but just in scanning the report, I saw that there was this sort of suspicion from the government officials on branded or agenda-driven materials. So while we international NGOs can take from this some good tips and pointers on communication, if it comes just from us, it's going to be seen as pushing our agenda. And you talked a little bit about needing to have sort of movement-wide or sector-wide messaging and values, but we're also having a little bit of collaboration fatigue in terms of SID and interaction and sector-specific groups. I mean, we're members of all of them, and I think it's pretty compelling that none of the government officials said, wow, SID Washington is a really great source for the leading discussion on X topic. So I'm wondering how you balance, you know, the desire for messaging and communications to be more sector-wide as opposed to individual agency or agenda-driven, and the fact that those collaborative groups aren't necessarily seen as the heavy hitters.
I think there are lots of other groups for whom these findings are more depressing. For example, look at how few, yes, the DevEx, there's ELDIS. Think of the universities. All of the universities who are involved in international development, policy making, think tanks. Not the think tanks per se, because the think tanks were mentioned, not the universities. They tended to be mentioning celebrity academics, the Paul Colliers, the Lawrence Haddads, many of whom have blogs. So it's not the institutions, it's those individuals who are the face of the institution. So that, for those, any academic institutions in the room, that's even more depressing. I thought what was very noticeable was how frequently across the countries, and I'm looking to clarify if it included China, where Oxfam was mentioned as a source of intelligence and information, because Oxfam has shifted away from its kind of images and implementation organization to a policy organization. And so it's for me, it's an example that it is possible to move into that space, but they've done that very, very deliberately. But you're right, none of the convening organizations, even in the UK, Bond was not mentioned at all. And Bond regards itself as a very prominent mover and shaker in the UK NGO space, but not by the people we spoke to. So yes, it's sobering. It's very sobering, because I think the other observation, and I think if we were to do this again, I think there's one constituency that we missed out on, and that is the private sector. And I don't mean corporate social responsibility departments of the private sector, but actually organizations, maybe they're multinationals, who are involved in work and investments in developing countries, to balance out, in a sense, the homogeneity of some of the entities we spoke to, even though they come from different organizations and they're journalists or they're NGOs or they're academics. There's a common mindset, or an assumption around a common mindset, which doesn't necessarily resonate with those in the private sector. And I think we were missing that. But I think if we'd included them, the findings here would have been even more depressing, because they wouldn't be aware of those organizations at all. One last comment, methodological comment on this, is we didn't prompt people. We didn't say, have you heard of ELDIS, have you heard of DevEx? So these were all unprompted questions, which in a sense are more honest, because it's what people have top of mind. But I'm sure if we'd done a more probing exercise, we would have unearthed some of those names.
I wanted to follow, actually, this question of neutrality, I guess. And, for example, they did mention the Center for Global Development as one place that they look at, because I guess it's considered as a neutral observer, if you will. I wondered if Paul, from this, as a maybe non-neutral party, what your feeling is about this issue in terms of making your voice heard with decision makers. Is that an issue for you? Do you try to, does your organization try to ally with perhaps other more neutral bodies to boost your message? Or
yeah, again, we're sui generis in part because any policy position we take has to be approved by the local Catholic Church in the country concerned, as well as by the U.S. bishops. So, talk about non-neutral. On the other hand, if it's about debt, if it's about peace, if it's about migration, You know, again, there's a lot of allies out there, in fact. And since we do have a constituency, and yet we're also operational, that brings up a number of different dilemmas and also sometimes contradictions. So because we're operational in Darfur, we don't speak out about certain things that are going on because we don't want to be kicked out of the country, even if, you know, and what we're doing in South Sudan as well. On the other hand, we are sometimes seen as a relatively neutral provider of information to influentials and particularly to government officials when we bring in overseas staff or partners and have a closed-door conversation about what is going on. And so I think it cuts a couple of different ways. For the Catholic constituency in particular, they want to make sure that the information we're giving is official. And again, and we try, you know, in the case of, let's say, it's hard to go back to the Lord's Resistance Army. In this particular case, the various churches are in Uganda and the DRC and CAR, they don't agree on a military approach necessarily to CONI and the LRA. So we haven't been active and weren't active on that piece of legislation. But when 70 million hits happened, we had a lot of requests from our constituency and the people who are answering the Catholics either in the pew or outside saying, what is this? What are you doing about it? And we were able to say, here's the general background, and we tried to give a neutral sense of what's going on, and no, the LRA is generally not in Uganda anymore, and kind of correcting without calling out the videos, saying here's what we are doing with local partners and local governments in northeastern DRC, in CAR, and in Uganda. So on the one hand, it's by definition non-neutral because it's coming from a very particular faith and hierarchical approval of policy. On the other hand, because we're both operational and have a constituency, when we try to mobilize that constituency for particular things based on the best information that we have, or if we're providing information to influentials or government, it can be more powerful because you know, we're seeing it on the ground, and we have some political weight here in the United States to back it up.
Hi, Susan Gillian from InterMedia. I have a question for my colleagues. It might be slightly heretical in the sense that you talked about, the study shows, you know, there's a very altruistic message. People, you know, they contribute. There's the moral responsibility. They want to be engaged, or they care what happens about people in the world. The study also showed that people see international development sort of as a zero-sum game. That if you sort of any efforts, you know, contributions to foreign assistance, $1 toward foreign assistance is $1 away from a domestic program. Where are the opportunities for building support for international development that are selfish? That, hey, why is this, you know, it's clear why it's good for the people in the developing countries. Why is it good for us? It seems to me there's an enormous communication opportunity to say, you know, given how the world is changing, given how things are so, you know, global and interdependent, that it's not just about helping someone else. It is about helping us, you know, especially because the focus in this study was on donor countries. So it does seem, I know this may be beyond what the data showed that you're able to speak to, but there does seem to be that communication opportunity.
Just before you respond, I think there might be other people in the room as well, based on their experience. That's a good question in terms of, you know, basing the argument on how is it actually helping us coming back, you know, in this interdependent world. So if anybody else wants to chime in as well after Jerry, feel free.
Let me take a stab and then ask Clara to supplement. The research I mentioned that AusAid conducted in Australia found that when you frame the question differently in terms of just the benefit of investing in international development to the benefit of other countries versus when you framed it in terms of why this would be good for the stability of the region we're living in and to maintain good relationships with our neighbours, the responses were hugely different. Exactly to your point, Susan. And we saw some of this again, I can speak for the UK groups, where people said, well, we know why we give the money. We change our country priorities according to our political interests. So in many ways, citizens are not naive about the political priorities of certain countries over others. And in many ways, it would be really interesting to test if a transparency and an honesty around that would engender a higher level of commitment when it is clearer that some of the objectives are self-interested for the host country. So I agree.
It's really interesting, and I think it boils down to the language again, because the Western countries that we were including in the study still talk about aid. China is not talking about aid, they're talking about investment. Right. And when we spoke to people there in focus group, they said, why we should be giving money to someone if we're not getting anything in return? Whereas that's not the case in the West. People still feel we need to help developing country because of global solidarity reasons or anything else. I think in the UK and the US, people want to know more and more what are they getting in return. Germany is a very different case, and I think the messaging around we should be doing this because it's good for us may not necessarily be good, a good way to go. But in the UK and the US, definitely, China is already way ahead of everyone else in that sense. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just take the mic and just say, I think it's interesting that in our community, in terms of interaction, some of the organizations that have been using, and other coalitions and alliances, some of which are made up of NGOs, some of which are made up of private sector actors, they've been using a security argument for development. And a number of us have really cautioned against that. And for faith-based constituencies, it really is about values and helping those in need, and seeing the connections. So that's one reason why it's not as powerful. But also, this did come up when we had an interaction discussion, and there was someone from the Gates Foundation who said she was part of one of the focus groups. And I said, would it be that perhaps the aid scandals around Iraq and Afghanistan, in theory, security investments, did they show up in the groups? And she said, yes, they did. So the idea that money down a rat hole, well, you have a couple of very strong examples. So I think for the U.S. government is untying aid right now. Even the food aid interests, are also again slowly coming apart. So some of those more instrumental, self-interested arguments, I think, are not going to work for a number of reasons. Though you can make a larger case, and even the stabilization, and some degree the health arguments also, I don't think are as powerful as saying we're helping people in need and we're actually making a difference.